Well, Ted Chaiban, the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, joins me in the studio. Ted, a lot of civilians, when we speak to people in Khartoum, which is very hard because I think since January mobiles have been pretty intermittent, the Rapid Support Force controlling much of the internet in their areas too, say it's a war that they really can't get much attention about, with the conflict in Israel dominating a lot of headlines. Can you describe what the situation is, particularly for children, for the work you're doing with UNICEF there?
Look, it's a catastrophe of unprecedented consequences in Sudan. It's the world's largest child displacement crisis in the world. 4.6 million children displaced. And we have almost 4 million children that are suffering from acute malnutrition, 1 million of which are suffering from severe acute malnutrition, which is life-threatening. And virtually every single Sudanese child, 19 million children, are out of school. We're at risk of losing a whole generation. And these are not just numbers. Each of those children is impacted personally. When I was in Sudan in June, I met with several of these children, and their whole lives has been turned upside down by this conflict.
It's interesting you say that. When you go back to, 20 years or so ago, Darfur, we had a whole generation became known as the lost boys of Sudan. From analysts I speak to, from those charity workers I've spoken to on the ground, they say what we're seeing now in terms of the scale of the conflict is worse than back in 2003. Aside of clearly atrocities committed by tribes related to the Rapid Support Force now. But just tell me, first of all, how you get continued humanitarian aid in. I've spoken to a lot of people who say, for example, trying to wire transfers to family, almost impossible to get food out there.
So firstly, let me say that the situation is as bad as it was during the first Darfur crisis 20 years ago. But the difference is it's forgotten this time. We're not talking about Sudan. And yet we're seeing the same pattern, the same ethnic targeting, the same displacement, the same killing of civilians. And what UNICEF is doing is using all means possible to try to access the population. We've had one of the first UN mission back into Khartoum to deliver health and nutrition supplies to the population, to support the few remaining health centers that are there on the ground. We're working cross-border from Chad into both South Darfur and North Darfur to try to reach the population there. And we're doing a lot of our work cross-line. And what we're calling for is for both parties to respect international humanitarian law, to allow access without precondition, and to respect humanitarian workers so that we can continue to do our job for children. In addition, we need funding. UNICEF is appealing for $840 million to support its work in Sudan. It is only 25% funded for that work. In neighbouring Chad, it's even worse. We're appealing for $55 million, and we're only 11% funded.
Because of all of the refugees, all of the displaced.
Because of all the refugees, almost 1 million refugees in Chad, 500,000 Sudanese, and some Chadian returnees coming back in the last year.
Give me a sense of what you think, realistically, tomorrow could achieve. The main parties, they're absent.
Firstly, we appreciate that the government of France, Germany, and the EU are convening this conference on Sudan. And the first objective is to generate resources, to mobilize resources so that humanitarians can continue to do their work. But we also need to have discussions about humanitarian access. We need to talk about international humanitarian law and respect for humanitarian principles. And in the morning, many of the special envoys that are focused on the crisis in Sudan will be meeting to look at a coordinated political way forward. There's a number of envoys working on the crisis. They need to work in a coordinated manner, but ultimately it's about the Sudanese party putting their people first and their egos second.
Briefly, it's quite hard. It's not quite a proxy war, but it's very complicated. When you look at the Saudis, the Egyptians, effectively supporting the army. You have the Rapid Support Force, which have gold reserves in Darfur now. You have the Russians, the old Wagner force, supporting them. You also have a facility that they're able to use in the UAE to transfer this cash. There's a sense of, there's a lot of entrenched sides here that need to be part of these talks in some way.
The point we're making is any party that has influence over either the government or the rapid support forces needs to exercise that influence so that we bring the parties to the table together, so that they respect human rights and international humanitarian law, and so that they allow access, including the blackout in telecommunications that you referred to, without communication we can't do our work. So indeed, there are many parties that can influence the Sudanese parties. Ultimately, it's about the Sudanese parties, however, putting their people first.
Very briefly, but it's important. Unlike in Gaza at the moment, do your teams at UNICEF feel relatively safe working on the ground right now?
Look, the answer is not enough. They are doing everything they can. We haven't faced the level of death that we've seen in Gaza among humanitarian, but clearly people are putting their lives at risk to make a difference for Sudanese children.
Ted Chaiban, thank you so much for talking to us. Ted Chaiban, the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, and good luck tomorrow.